Welcome to the Elixir podcast, where we ask people from all walks of life and from around the world what their favourite poem is and why it's important to them, why or how it speaks to their heart. If you have a poem that you would like to share and would like to appear on the podcast, please contact me at helenwing@me.com. Hello and welcome to the Elixir podcast. This is the podcast where we ask people from all around the world to read a poem that means something to them, and then we ask them why. Today we're talking to Nelleke, who lives in Colchester in Essex. Hello, Nelleke.
Hello.
I believe you're going to talk to us about a Dutch poem, is that right?
I am. It's a poem by Hendrik Marsman.
Okay. Would you like to read it to us?
Yep. Here it goes. It's called Memories of Holland. Thinking of Holland, I see wide flowing rivers slowly traversing infinite plains. Inconceivably rarefied poplars like lofty plumes on the skyline in lanes. And submerged in the vastness of unbounded places, the farmhouses strewn through the land. Tree clumps, truncated towers, churches and elm trees, all wondrously planned. The sky hangs low and slowly the sun by mists of all colours is stifled and greyed. And in all the regions, the voice of the water, with its endless disasters, is feared and obeyed.
Wow, Nelleke, that really does conjure up a picture of Holland to me. So what does that poem mean to you? What do you think about when you read that poem?
I think it is really evocative of the Holland that I know from my childhood and from my family when I visit them. And it really puts me in mind of my mother, who left Holland in her late 20s, early 30s, in the same way that Hendrik Marsman did. He left and travelled Europe as a poet and got involved with the Expressionists and did all sorts of things, writing poetry as he went. And this poem was written in 1936, I think, or published in 1936, when he was abroad. And he was looking back and thinking about his land. And the land in Holland, unless you live right in the middle of a city, and even then there's water all around you, it is all about the water. It's all about the sky and the water channels as people go through and round. And it's particularly interesting in terms of thinking back on a landscape that you know, and it is unchanged, but of course it's completely man-made, because it's all been carefully planned with straight lines and straight trees and straight everything. And it's fascinating to see. In a way, I think what's interesting is it's a land that is not personal. It is very personal, but it's the same everywhere. So it's not personal. It's not a particular corner of it. It's the whole of it. The wide rivers that start and end in Holland and gone all the way through Europe, and the houses and the dotting of the farms in between all the rivers. I don't know. It's just so Dutch.
But your mother never went back to live in Holland. She settled in England.
She did. She settled in England. And actually, when I was thinking about a poem for this, and you asked me if I could find a poem that I remembered from my childhood, I thought, well, I don't remember any Dutch poetry. I don't remember ever being read Dutch poetry. I remember stories, and I remember speaking Dutch with my family. But then I got to thinking, I never remember my mother reading Dutch. I don't remember her reading. And when I looked through her books when she died, there were no books in Dutch at all, apart from her father's Bible and a dictionary. Wow. And I just thought, wow, she never read in Dutch. She didn't maintain a contact with that culture, as far as I know. Whereas she was very well read and read French and read German and read all sorts of books in translation, and she read a lot, but not in Dutch.
I wonder why that is. She was educated in foreign literature, wasn't she? Didn't she?
Yeah, she started a degree in French literature, and she spent time in Paris and Amsterdam, and then she met my father, and they moved across here and started a business, and that was that. But she felt a foreigner in Holland, and she felt a foreigner here. I think I remember her saying, the longer you're away from your homeland, the less you are like the people in your homeland. And I think there are reasons why people stay away.
Yeah. And how do you feel as the next generation? Do you feel like a stranger in a strange land, or do you feel really British, or do you feel Dutch, or both?
I think in common with many people who have heritage that isn't from the country they live in, they don't feel particularly, I mean, I don't feel very English, but when I go to Holland, or the Netherlands, as I should call it, I don't feel particularly Dutch. I feel more English in Holland and more Dutch in England.
Yes, I think that's a really common experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what I also like about this poem is that the language is really I mean, the translation is quite a good translation, I think, but it doesn't bring across. There's so much language in here that is language I recognise from probably hymns.
Mm-hmm.
If I think back, there's hymnal language in here. There's language of the Bible. The word that they use for feared is gevreesd, which is a terrible word. Vreselijk is a terrible word in Dutch, and it's interesting how I recognise those words because I don't read in Dutch either. So it's it's great, but it's hymnal in a way.
It would be really sad if Dutch gets lost. I once met a couple in, I think it was the UAE, who were both Dutch, and we were talking about language, and their children they never spoke to their children in Dutch, even though they were Dutch, and they didn't think there was any point in learning Dutch. So their children were being brought up in English and Arabic, but they weren't valuing their Dutch linguistic heritage, which I found very strange because, Holland actually is, Netherlands are very proud of their heritage in many ways, and still, as we know, maintain a royal family, and they do have very particular symbols of their identity that they want to purvey in their own country and abroad. So it really amazes me that there's less of a instinct to preserve it than you might expect. And in contrast, say, to the Flemish in Belgium next door, who are very proud of their, if you like, Dutch-ish roots and maintain their language furiously and are desperate not to lose it. So I don't know what's going to happen in the end to Dutch language.
I don't either. I mean, I know that most people are bi or trilingual. I'm very proud of that, and very happy to speak with you in English or French or German or whatever it is you want to speak to them in. But I think the Dutch are proud of being Dutch. I think they're very, very clear that they are Dutch. They're not just European. I think that my family certainly, who don't live in the cities, they are very proud of being Dutch and what that means. And, and I suppose in a way, maybe the Dutch have got this kind of defender instinct, which is they're constantly having to build up their borders to stop the water coming in, to stop the ingress. So maybe that's carrying on also with them in terms of their nationality or their sense of place, always trying to protect it against the dreadful fear of disaster.
Can I ask another question about your mother? Did your mother insist on speaking Dutch with you and insist that you would learn Dutch? Or was she quite lackadaisical about it?
I think that I was brought up, my first language was Dutch. My parents were together when I was born, obviously. Well, my mother and father were both Dutch, and they spoke Dutch with each other in the household. And we all learnt Dutch, me and my brothers. When my parents split up, after I came back from living in Holland for a time, in Belgium, in fact, I lived in Belgium for a time. When I started school, I didn't really have much English. And then I started speaking English at school. And I think what happened is that I made the choice to speak English. And I think that's quite common in bilingual children, that they will choose a language that they're going to use. And that became the language I used with my mother. And so it was quite difficult to speak Dutch with her because once you've got a natural language you use with somebody, it's quite hard to swap. But I still went to Holland a lot in my childhood, and I kept my Dutch alive by spending the whole of the school holidays with my grandparents and my cousins and my lovely aunt and uncle where I spoke Dutch constantly.
And I don't know whether this is true in general in Britain, but I feel that at least in my school days, we were all fabulously incurious about other people's culture and lives. So we didn't know who their parents were, what they did, where they came from, and we might know that someone was foreign because they had an odd name. But it never occurs to us to say, oh, so what language do you speak at home? or where do you go in the holidays? Or what does your culture talk about, believe in, or anything, And I don't know whether that's a curiously British thing, something to do with us being on an island, that we just, subsume everyone into our sphere. But there is, I think, a real lack of curiosity in people about especially their linguistic heritage,
I think that's certainly right when we were young. And I remember, once anybody had met my mother, it was very, very obvious she was Dutch because she had a very thick Dutch accent, which is difficult to lose.
Yeah, and of course she made us all eat pea soup.
That's right, snert.
Which was completely alien to the British world.
Yes. I think that lack of curiosity is indeed interesting. And I look back and think, oh, I didn't know that person had that heritage. Or, yeah, absolutely. We didn't ask.
Yeah.
Some things became obvious. But, yes, we were all just so concerned with our own
little worlds.
Yeah. People, don't we?
I guess that's children for you. Mm. So, Nelleke, would you like to read this poem again to us so that we can have a vision of you and your mum and your family in Holland?
Am I going to do it in English or Dutch?
You're going to do it in English first, and then I'm going to ask you to read it in Dutch.
Memory of Holland. Thinking of Holland, I see wide flowing rivers slowly traversing infinite plains. Inconceivably rarefied poplars like lofty plumes on the skyline in lanes, and submerged in the vastness of unbounded spaces, the farmhouses strewn through the land. Tree clumps, villages, truncated towers, churches and elm trees, all wondrously planned. The sky hangs low, and slowly the sun, by mists of all colours, is stifled and greyed. And in all the regions the voice of the water, with its endless disasters, is feared and obeyed.
Wow. It is really beautiful. It's really beautiful.
And the sad thing about the poem is that it is his memory of Holland. And as I said earlier, Hendrik Marsman travelled Europe from the age of, in his mid-30s, he travelled around Europe. He met his wife and they carried on travelling around Europe. And from 1933, now what was happening in Holland was that it was occupied by the Nazis, and there was quite a lot. I think that Holland had the largest fascist party in Europe outside of Germany. Wow. And he never went back to live. And he finally managed to get hold of a Portuguese passport for him and his wife. And they set sail from Bordeaux, I believe, on a boat that then was sunk in 1936. In 1940, I apologise, in 1940, he died trying to travel to England, and his wife was the only surviving passenger.
Oh, how terrible.
Yeah, sad tale. The other thing about this poem, which I hadn't heard until I started looking into it, this was voted by the Dutch people as the poem of the century in 2000.
Wow, so probably because it is so vivid, right? And it is so Dutch. But your mother was in Holland during the war, wasn't she?
She was. She was born in 1933, so she experienced the war as a child and a teenager.
Mm-hmm. Did she ever talk to you about it?
Yeah, she talked about the horror. Her father was in the underground and was away for a lot of the war, and they lived in a small village. And she talked of the fear and the hunger, and had a few actual examples of being very close to guns and all sorts of things. And they hid people, and they experienced it in a completely different way to anybody from this country experienced the war at that age. And then after the war, her father returned and decided that he couldn't bear to live in the same village with all the people. As he said, he used to say, I didn't want to live and kneel on the same kneelers in church as those fascists, the people that had collaborated with the Germans. And so he decided to emigrate to Australia. So the whole family went to Australia. And unfortunately, my grandmother disliked it so much. And they didn't have a great time. It wasn't the wonderful life in the New World, because you had to work really hard and it was very hard, very difficult. And they then spent several years saving up to come home. And they did end up back in the same village.
Wow.
But he stopped going to church. That was his answer. But my mother never went back. She went to Australia and she then went to Amsterdam and then came to England.
Amazing. Well, Nelleke, it's been wonderful to hear a few stories about your family heritage in Holland. I wonder if now you would like to read it to us in Dutch. So I'm sure it sounds wonderful in Dutch.
Okay. Herinnering aan Holland. Denkend aan Holland zie ik brede rivieren, traag door oneindig laagland gaan. Rijen ondenkbaar eilen populeren als hoge pluimen aan de einder staan. In de geweldige ruimte verzonken de boerderijen verspreid door het land. Boomgroepen, dorpen, geknotte torens, kerken en olmen in een groots verband. De lucht hangt er laag en de zon wordt er langzaam in grijze veelkleurige dampen gesmoord. En in alle gewesten wordt de stem van het water met zijn eeuwige rampen gevreesd en gehoord.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nelleke. It's been a delight and a privilege to have you on the podcast. Thank you very much.
It's been absolutely lovely spending the time and thinking about these things. Thank you.
Okay. For our listeners, I should say we are going to be putting the poem in English and in Dutch on our link in the podcast and also on my website, helenwing.com. Thank you very much for listening. If you're a regular listener and are enjoying the podcast, it would mean the world to me if you could hit the follow button on your podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review and a 5-star rating. Remember, you can find the poems that feature in each episode on my website, helenwing.com. If you'd like to support the production costs of our Elixir Poetry podcast, please feel free to buy me a coffee. Thanks for listening.